Welcome back to another episode of Enter the Matrix, which will probably be also scuffed as we just went through like 10 minutes of technical issues. So let's see if they will come back again. Because as two tech bros and one person who's technologically inept, we are surely doing great. And anyway, on that note, today we'll be talking about Pyra. And we even already have Ben complaining that he got the flu from Pyra, and I think that's just a common thing when you talk to anyone who attended the event. But before we get into Pyra, how have you guys been? Brian, you'll be the second. Nathan first.
Not too bad, not too bad. Although saying I was just inept at technology was a very nice way of putting that. Usually it would be a word that would probably get us cancelled. But overall, still reeling from one of the worst events I've ever had at Manchester. Just out of pure dumpster fire of dice and cards. But that's what happens when you take dog shit for an army. So yeah, fun times. Other than that, I am all good. A lot better than apparently everybody who went to Pyra, who got the plague. How you been, Brian?
Well, I've had the plague. That's been quite terrible. So I think the entire U.S. team is down for the count. I was supposed to be in Manchester this weekend, but that didn't happen because I was too busy being sick. But otherwise, got a bunch of personal projects coming up soon, which are occupying all my time. Moving and job hunting and everything else. So it's quite hectic, and I would have liked to have taken the break in Manchester, played some Warhammer.
Yeah, but you had the break of laying down completely sick, right? Was it like not being able to do anything level sick, or just like being slightly uncomfortable?
I spent at least
best answer.
Yeah. I spent about 3 days in bed just sleeping, hoping to break whatever this is going to be. But yeah, it has been pretty miserable.
Okay. So then, there's not really much to talk specifically now, but maybe Nathan, before we go into Pyra full on, why do you say that the Manchester was so bad for you? What happened there? Because I have some info, and I remember that Pumbaa was mocking you for your list choices. So
Yeah.
let's maybe get into that.
Yeah, like the lovely man that Pumbaa is just messaged in our group chat being like, Nathan, isn't your list ass? And I'm like, I don't know, it might be okay. I bought it months ago. I should probably try it. And that's why he's a coach now, because he was right. It was ass. Damage output, spectacular. Ability to put points on the board, shockingly bad. For those that don't know, I tried a Raiders shooting list because most of the objectives are kind of in the open in the middle of UKTC tables. So I thought, I'm usually playing gun lines. This one's a little bit more dynamic. It turns out you actually have to be able to score to win games. And the meta has shifted enough, thanks to predominantly, I would imagine, Eldar, that the game is a lot more MSUE now. And even on UKTC terrain, people were still taking predominantly what you might call more scoring-heavy, trixier armies than what the meta would have been not 2 or 3 months ago, say Nottingham, which is January. So, yeah, I teched. I would say I teched. I didn't tech. I tried to take an army that, because I bought it, I should use it, which, if you're trying to do well at tournaments, is a terrible idea. You should just play what's actually good. But it was fun anyway.
Okay.
Except I had to wait. Not only did I go 3-2, which is below my standard, I usually hope to go at least 4-1. I then had to wait an extra 6 hours for Josh to finish because Josh doesn't do quick games. So I didn't get back to it from Manchester till about 1:15 in the morning. So that was fun.
Lovely.
Good
Really
weekend.
mistake. And you got to make sure that you're the best person in the car, so that you like to let everyone else is waiting for you, and you're not waiting for them.
But me and Josh like to ride share because it's more environmental. It's not. It's just because it saves a lot of money. But it sucked ass. Like my list.
I thought, like, talking to you, I find that happens quite often, right? That you have to wait for Josh. Something's not going well there, man.
He's such a tryhard, man. He just likes to win everything, and it just means that he takes good stuff and plays well. Whereas I'm a little bit more. That looks fun. I'll try that. Oh, it went 5-0. Oh, it went 3-2. It's the same. So yeah, unfortunately, I do have to find myself waiting around. I tried to find somebody going back to Nottingham, but it then would have meant that they had to wait 6 extra hours. So realistically, it was only me.
Okay.
So fun.
Then, as we have Manchester covered out, let's get back to Pyra, because I don't think there was that much, any, how do you call it? My brain is just fucking zoning off today. People coverage. Yeah, that's the word. Coverage of the event overall. I know Tyler mentioned it, but 2 of the main shows didn't mention it because Anthony was a bitch twice. And we just didn't get any coverage from his side. But from your end, before we get to people who are boots on the ground there, Nathan, have you had any information? Do you know if, for example, the English boys were looking at BCP, or how did it look from your end overall?
As in, how did England feel like they did, or as in what was Pyra as an idea?
Throughout the event, and then I'm just interested how you guys are feeling, because for this event I was kind of in Team USA, and I can probably share some ideas with Brian. So I would like to first, Brian, I think that was the worst performance of Team USA in a long time. You just need to include polls to drag you down. I think that's the common sense.
Just a little bit. Pops it up a lot, dude. That's all. That's all I'm saying. It's good.
So I think going into Pyra, it's weird that it didn't get much coverage because I would almost argue it's the most competitive or most difficult team event to win other than the WTC. Because if you look at it as who went to this event, it was, 6 of the... Other than Spain, it was 6 of the top 7. It was then another in the top 10, and then another that was 11th or 12th, Netherlands finished.
Then there was the Netherlands and Poland B. So
yeah. So it's one of those where I think realistically England's going through a bit of a rebuild. So it was a case of, after seeing the pods, or to be honest, any of the pods, that the likelihood was that they were maybe not going to go into the higher bracket because you've got world champions and either people brought their A teams or whatever. So I think England's, what was going to be viewed as a good Pyra event would be something like they beat the Netherlands, beat Poland B, and then got some kind of result against Poland A, or whoever dropped out into the second tier from the other group. So trying to get
interrupt you here, because for those who are unaware, the event was split into 2 4-team pods, which basically had 3 top 6 teams from the WTC, top 7 actually, if we were to be specific, and then Netherlands in one and Poland B in the other group. And out of those groups, 2 teams would go to the second day in the higher bracket and 2 teams would go in the lower bracket. So what you, for example, see in the BCP as a result is not necessarily true, because BCP doesn't allow changes to adjust for that. So BCP, I think, shows, for example, Poland A being over USA, but they would be like top of the bottom bracket, and USA would be bottom of the top bracket, right? So there's a little bit of that. But what Nathan's saying is that you guys were looking to like challenge
win the lower bracket.
Better,
yeah. Which I think would have been a successful. Not that I don't think it wasn't successful, but yeah, winning the bottom bracket would have been good, because you've then got at least a result out of everyone except maybe people who are seeing the pod, say France, USA, Poland B and England were in one pod. France are current world champions. USA are always chasing for a title. So the likelihood is that those were going to be very, very tough rounds. If you could steal some points, great. But if that's not the case, try and win bracket 2.
And I think it is worth mentioning here that after the event, we were talking to people, and there was some discrepancy in terms of the level of the teams brought there. Because if you were to look at it, you had Sweden, who I think had 6 returning starters. Brian, correct me if I'm wrong at any of those. France, which also had 6 or like 5, but they also had previous WTC team members in there. And then you had Poland A, which was basically half of the returning starters, and USA only had 2 starters in the raid. And then you had Poland B, which was, I don't think they had any returning. No, they had 1 person who was back in 2017. And then Netherlands was also a lot of new players. England was, I think, only new players.
Yes, there's nobody on that Pyra team has been to a WTC before.
Yeah, so I think there was a discrepancy between those teams that and then Germany, who they had like 4 returning starters or 5, but also had players who were previously on the team. So they weren't any slouches either. So I think there was a difference in like how teams took this event in terms of bringing the best players or trying out the newer faces who will be the potential new prospects on the team. So I don't think you can take away that much in terms of which nation came the most prepared, the best prepared, because every team had something that they were just trying out. And I think that was the idea of the event. Just some teams were trying out team comps, some teams were trying out the players.
Sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is also virtue of just different selection processes, right? So like, Sweden was much more advanced in their selection process. I think Germany's a little more too, but the US doesn't pick anybody until April. Same with England, it's much slower. So like the teams that were less advanced along their process were trying out more players than lists, and the ones that were more advanced had kind of already settled on a lot of their team. There's no point bringing prospects to that point, so you just bring good players and trail lists.
Yeah, and I don't think that's bad at all. It's just you cannot really read into the results as much, except I think you can read into the meta, and I really, really enjoyed the event overall as just a way of learning the meta, because I think what we knew before the event and after event is 2 completely different things. Like we face checked into the meta, most teams face checked into the meta and learned what was working on and what wasn't. So what's your take on the event overall, Brian, before we get like into games or whatnot? Like how did the preparation for you guys look?
It was eye-opening, I think. I was mostly looking at it from the perspective coming into it. You always want to win an event, but that was one of the times where it really wasn't the highest priority for me. I was more concerned about seeing how our little ducklings swim in the European waters, right? And I think everyone learned a lot. I learned a lot about players. They learned a lot about kind of what playing at this level is like. And even some of the instances where maybe they didn't quite live up to where we want them to be, they all demonstrated a lot of maturity in their post-game analysis and how they've kind of redressed mistakes they made or owning those mistakes in ways that was really, really quite refreshing to see, because it's oftentimes not about not falling down, but rather how well you stand up afterwards. And I think everybody on the team really demonstrated their ability in that. So that was really nice to see. And then it also kind of helped me understand a little more about where the meta is with respect to some of the matchups and some of the armies. There's some matchups we thought were bad that ended up, French being CSM player being a great example of this, where this is a matchup in Eldar that we thought Vile was going to get its doors blasted off, and the French Vile player just figured it out. You play on these maps, bait him into a green, and turns out that I get a win here. And that shows a level of kind of preparation and insight and practice, which really kind of underlines the whole process. Because that's not something you figure out going into like a Manchester singles event, right, or an ITT or something like that. That's WTC level prep. If I defend on these specific maps against these armies, I'm going to have a chance of turning a red into a green, and that's really cool. So I'm glad our guys got to see stuff like that.
Yeah, and what I really enjoyed was when I was also listening to Take All Commerce, Tyler talking, that people saw like sometimes how different is the game when playing on those boards in such limited time frame compared to all those tests on TTS. That's something that will just suddenly come up and you will have an issue with it. But overall, what I found the most refreshing after the event is that obviously I knew like basically jack shit about the game because I was coming back from a short hiatus. But how much the meta was open. I find that at any 8-man team event, both teams are happy with pairings. It is very rare that someone is unhappy, right? But I found that everyone was making mistakes in terms of their estimations or what they thought. And I'm curious because I saw also in like the show questions that people were talking about the impact of the new WTC boards that were used, by the way. I haven't really felt it. I don't know about you, Brian. I saw them, but I think the only case where it mattered was Tipping Point.
Yeah, Tipping Point definitely made a difference, but also the Tipping Point maps before always felt pretty half-baked. So now they were kind of
they still kind of do, but I think this is a problem of us being limited to the L shapes and the deployment zones.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. I also think you're making a good point about the armies too. I usually coming out of an event, like 8-man team events, there's at least a couple armies, like at least one army on every team where you're like, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have taken that army, right? And I don't actually think that was true for USA this year. I don't think that was true for any of the armies I've looked at from other people with their comps, where I look at it and I'm like, them taking that army was just a mistake. Maybe the execution fell short, maybe the pairings fell short and stuff like that, but the army selection itself, it just feels so wide open that it's so much less about which army you're taking now and more about how well you're executing with that army.
Yeah. What I think stood out to me is how I think people were too scared about Eldar. And suddenly Eldar not only were preyed on, but also under-delivered for most of the teams unless you were Matthew. Like I think only Matthew and Victor, I think they were like the only players who won most of their games, but they like were also kind of protected. And I found that nearly every time that Eldar attacked into something, it didn't work. That's just something about the event. Yeah.
Dan Whitaker also went 4-1 as well.
Yeah.
He had a good event.
Yeah. So
the Ynnari list performed best, whereas the others kind of struggled a little bit more.
And I think the meta was actually well adapted into Eldar. I find every team figured out counters. And I think like the biggest takeaway when it comes to factions and choices for me was Chaos Knights. They maybe didn't bring insane scores sometimes, but man, were they an absolute problem in pairings for us in our hand quite a lot when it came to how do we handle pairings. I think they were in a really good position overall.
I think Chaos
Anything stood out to you?
Right, because I think oftentimes there's another thing I find is a truism of 8-man teams, right? And I mean, this might be a USA thing, but there's always an army which we are very dismissive of in terms of playing. We're like, oh, no, we're not going to play Chaos Knights. Like, come on, what are we doing here, boys? But then when we go to the pairings and the matrices where we actually have to play against and pair against Chaos Knights, our matrix looks terrible. And we're like, why are we saying this army's bad if the matrix is so good into us, right? So clearly something's being missed, and Chaos Knights, I think, was a great example of that this time. Whereas we didn't give it enough credit leading into the event, and our pairings had to be duck dived and dodged all the way through as a result.
Anything stood out to you, Nathan, looking from outside or like from the English debrief about the meta, about the armies?
Like I won't talk from an England perspective because obviously I don't want to put words in, say, other people's mouths. But
put them in Danish.
No, I think what stood out, I guess, from a much bigger perspective is the Grotmus detachments were by far more popular than any others, but they're still kind of in their infancy a little bit. There was enough scope that you could do well with certain armies, like you just mentioned with CK, but I think another one was Leagues of Votan. Now, I know Tim has pioneered them for Germany forever, and he is one of the reasons why Germans rate them so highly, but the French and German Votan lists both did very well. I think another one that was written off a little bit by England, there's two a little bit written off by England were like the creations lists, which pretty much all the top teams took. Actually, all the top teams took. And Death Guard as well. Death Guard have a really good place in the meta now with kind of being able to play against combat armies, but being mechanized enough that they can kind of play most things. And obviously the French one going 5-0 was very, very impressive as well. So there was a few standout lists that actually just did really well.
Yep. Anything to add, Brian, on this topic before we go further?
I think that the army which I'm still still uncertain on is Slanesh Demons, because obviously they did well, but and they did better than I think we were willing to give them credit that they were going to do, but they also didn't do as well as they were hyped up to do, I think. So to me, kind of Slanesh Demons have settled into this space of it's a solid pressure army, but there's a lot of pressure armies you can play that could fill that slot. So you're not faulted for taking it, but there's also, if you were to flip it and take some other kind of a pressure army, like a World Eaters or something, as long as you have a pilot, then I think that it would be a perfectly acceptable army to slot into that space. So, so weirdly, Demons, I feel like, didn't get clarified, but also did at the same time.
I think they felt still underwhelming.
Yeah.
Like they felt fine, but both games that you guys lost 9-11 into them were on like the best mission for that specific matchup. Like the Slanesh into Admech Teraxi list on Purge is like, okay, out of all the missions, that's the one that Access can play. And the one mission they played Anthony was on the additional objective, so suddenly Anthony couldn't play Primary Denial as effective on 6 objectives they can hold, which is, So there might be something about them being mid-table menace, but I really enjoyed when we had that debrief on Friday, not debrief, but like pre-brief, let's call it that, on Friday evening, was explaining what happens if Slanesh does this, and players were like, "Ooh." So you want to maybe talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a Polish tradition, which we adopted, which I really like, which I was told, I think by Gitto afterwards, that it's, or maybe it was Leshu, it's called going to confessional with Father Typhus. And so you essentially, in this instance, it was, Anthony, myself, Typhus, and Pumbaa kind of looked through the matrix that people had entered and just kind of identified what sections and particular pairings that we were skeptical on, right? That we just wanted to hear a little more about, right? And then we would bring the player up and we would talk about that matrix and that entry point. And the goal wasn't to convince them to change their mind, right? Because our job is not to tell you how to play your game. But what we wanted them to do was walk through why they had this is a good matchup or a bad matchup in this particular instance. Talk us through it, understand their thinking and their rationale. 9 times out of 10, that resulted in us just being like, "Cool, sounds good, man. You got good thinking here. That's great. Let's move on and knock it out from there." Didn't always pan out where that still played out in the board, but again, our job wasn't to try and get them to reach the promised land, right? It was just to, not put Jesus in their heart, rather, but just to tell them about the Lord. But Slanesh was one of the examples where I think there were a number of times where Slanesh can do certain things which people don't appreciate what that can do to a board state. So I think one of the examples that I was used was for into like a game against, say, Eldar, for example. I would say, like, what if Slanesh puts just a chariot on the middle and nearby is a keeper of secrets and they put wounds onto that keeper of secrets? How much of your army has to go into trying to kill those things before you've successfully done it? And then, the answer inevitably ends up being, well, I can get it. I have enough damage. I'll be able to kill that stuff. And I say, cool, that's great. What's the next step, right? When the entire Slanesh army, besides those 2 units, collapses on you, right? What actually happens into the game and the board at that point? And that was kind of, I think, for a number of people, oh yeah, you're right. Actually, that would then result in that next step being we lose the game from there, or the game slips out of control, or whatever the case is. And that kind of helped people, I think, get our, at the time, very optimistic Slanesh matrix into a more reasonable space. So the exercise overall, I think, was super useful. And it wasn't even just useful for, I think, our players, but also, from my perspective as somebody who was doing the questioning, it was really useful too, to understand how they were thinking.
Yeah. You put yourself in the other army's position, which is always nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's in general a nice thing to do. But if any other team is trying to adopt stuff like that, I have one big consideration that you should take into account, and that is, do not take more than 2 years, because at a point everyone will start chiming in and it becomes just too many cooks in the kitchen, and that can get very chaotic very quick.
Yeah, I think getting the vibe right is also really important, right? You need to make sure that it's not coming across as you're wrong and we just need you to understand why you're wrong, but rather just like a conversation and they can kind of articulate what they're thinking, because again, that needs to be the earnest effort, is not to convince them that they're wrong, because I don't know their army, and I probably don't know the matchup army very well, and so I can't really. I'm just looking at it from the perspective of a Warhammer 40K player and asking myself, if I had to matrix this with the knowledge I have, what would I put? And that's where the discrepancy comes in, and then we just have to talk about it.
And now another question, Brian, because we were talking about it on the route back from Międzyrzecz. How are you feeling about Orcs now? Because you were playing very similar list, and there was one topic that we talked about, being the big Gretchen squad with Zodgrod, that kind of was skimmed over, but as soon as we realized that the 20-man squad with -1 to wound and 6-inch reactive move after something falls back from the combat log becoming quite good. So what was your take on like Orcs after the event? Because you were talking about going back to Warhorde, like you weren't feeling the tactical brigade as much afterwards. So anything to add there?
Yeah, I think
Have you thought more?
I think that I'm still a big fan of tactical. I think having the shooting is really powerful. But I also think that, and I felt this coming into the event too, the tactical and Warhorde are actually very, very close to each other in terms of power level. And as tactical, I'm sure, begins to face his comeuppance of having really good shooting, and some kind of efforts or tweaks are made to bring it a little more in line. Warhorde becomes more and more appealing, because it's just an incredibly good detachment. Like Warhorde is the Gladius of Orcs, right? You know, it's good damage, it's fight on death, it's got Kareen, it's got incredible stats, right? So it's just a really, really solid detachment. Overall, though, with respect to Orcs, regardless of whether it's tactical or Warhorde, I think they are one of the best armies in the game, especially when in a space of teams. They're one of the armies which I can't imagine not having on your team. Where you would have a pilot trained to play Orcs, even if they're not currently good enough to play Orcs, or they don't have an Orc pilot already, right? That's to me, that's the hallmark of an army, especially right now, of an army that should be on the team. There's not very many of those, I don't think, and I think Orcs fall into that category, because, when you have something like Warhorde, you have the ability to get these big wins with a tiny bit of protection. But when you have something like tactical, my Matrix had, I think, maybe like a total of 2 bad matchups on it for the entire weekend.
Oh yeah.
It was just like, it was greens and a couple draws and stuff like that. And a lot of times I swung up on my draws, and it's just having an army like that, which can play into anything, and get back pretty reasonable results is super powerful to have, especially when you.
I think in general, Brian was like, every game he was trending towards 12, except one game where he got jailed. And every single one of those games, he was always in a position to push for a higher score if need be for the team, which is something that was mentioned quite a lot in previous podcasts or different podcasts, that having an army in your team that if shits just goes bad after like round 2 of the whole hour in, you realize that you will be needing points somewhere. You have an army that at any point can just go for those points, and that's having that explosive factor is quite useful.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
sure. How did Typhus, how did you find it doing a lot of our pairings, having an army like Orcs with the Matrix that I had? How did you find you wanted to use it, and did it kind of pan out where you could use it that way?
So what I loved about it is I didn't really care about it, right? What I found, it really covered as a duo of attackers into some armies. It was really, really useful to just. Sometimes you and Anthony were like a duo that would just demolish something. Sometimes it was you and Stormlands, and it was just useful. And to an extent that I didn't even want to defend with you. I think I defended with Germany. That's when you got voted.
It was the French, because I got my table for Sylvia.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I didn't want to defend with you because you were good enough across the board that I would rather escape with something else in the pairings, because you also seemed like you didn't really care that much about what board you had. Like,
yeah,
it mattered slightly, but
it was nice. And generally speaking, I think Orcs don't need much board support. Tactical, even less so. Orcs need a couple ruins to stage from. Almost every board on the game has that, right? They usually have a relatively small footprint because of the trucks. So they're able to play on most boards pretty comfortably. And then tactical is even able to take that a step further and take advantage of certain boards, right? So if I'm playing against a shooting army, I can play on a heavy one and be okay. If I'm playing against a combat army, I can play on a light one and be okay. Or in the case of, like say my game against Olivier, I just recognized that I was the better shooting army in terms of like winning a gunfight, and so I just picked a light board, and it was really, really useful in that game. So being able to pick the light board against Space Marines and outshoot them is pretty cool.
Yeah, I in general like Orcs. I found them like something that I always seek to have in my team comp, because you usually have enough pairings that you want to escape whilst doing the whole pairing process. But having one army that can just land anywhere, I think this kind of applies to what you were playing, Nathan, right? Like you were playing the Plague Storm or Nids. Like those armies also kinda land in that area, that those armies can just be used for anything. And having like one or two of those armies in your team comp is just very, very powerful, because if we do not have a blunt, that army can become a blunter. So, or if you need a defender, that army can become a defender. But into some armies, it is an attacker. Like this is a very flexible army that has many uses in the pairing process, depending at which stage of the pairings are we in. And it's just the best thing you can have on the team as a pairing guy. So there's one question from the chat. Simon is asking, question for Brian. At this level, it's a lot less beers with the boys. Tyler spoke briefly on morale following your round four. Were you affected? So what's your take, Brian?
So for context, round 4 was our round to Germany. We were punted a bit into the sun that round. It was a rough one. Anthony and myself both lost as well. And then a couple of our guys had a bunch of matchups for positive, swing in the direction we didn't want it to go. So I would say that one was tough, but because of the fact that I had come into the event with the mindset of, I want to win, but that's not the most important thing to me. It wasn't too bad with respect to the morale that I personally was facing, because I felt like we really learned a lot about players' matchups, how they handle challenging situations in that moment, and a lot of, I think, what we found out was positive, and that was good to see, and so that kind of lifted. Might have lost the round, but I'm looking to August, and I think we gained a lot of good out of that. I'd rather lose it now than lose it in August, right?
Yeah, and I would like to add a little bit, because Tyler spoke about it, that there wasn't like the companionship maybe, or like the leadership that you guys usually have, because basically it was me and Pumba taking over the reins. But and first of all, yeah, we are not Americans when it comes to just the culture, right? Because I think the Polish people are more like, now we do work, no funsies, next round, then funsies. And that's just who we are as human beings when it comes to playing it at WTC and whatnot. So what Tyler said is that there wasn't like that much of a leadership, and I think that's actually true, because the event also doesn't lean into gathering the morale of the troops, because you have 3.5 hour rounds, and then you do not really have a break, and then you play another round, so there's no time to actually recover, right? It's just too packed. Like, you already know Nathan from when we played with the super team. Like, it's just another round after another round. You cannot really
pretty much
do what you do at WTC when you have 1.5 hours and you just go. Everyone distresses however they seem fit, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that was probably a bit of a failing one on the part of Anthony and myself, in that kind of being that veteran role. But we didn't kind of try and pull everyone up in that moment. But at the same time, to your point, this is like Anthony and I tend not to serve that role with the proper
Yeah.
team when we're there in August. So
Yeah.
we weren't prepared to kind of do it, and I think we certainly hadn't recognized that was something which needed to happen, because I think Anthony and I tend to also not really need it as often, which isn't so that we're like more resilient than anyone else, but more just like we kind of are able to compartmentalize things, I think, better than other people can. So I think that's something which we definitely could have worked on a little better, was recognizing that need, and that kind of that gulf of leadership that could have maybe stepped in and just added a little bit of context from our own experiences that might have helped people.
Maybe, Nathan, you have any specific questions to us, as you weren't there.
So, as you guys are there, how, with the way that balance updates are more regular now, what is the best way to use one of these 8-man events? Is it purely the results don't matter? To be honest, the armies don't matter because they might potentially change. It's just seeing how people get on? Or do you think there are certain things that you need to do beyond that? So, like you just mentioned there, do you need to work on team building or team cohesion, things like that? Or is it just a case at this point where you should just be testing people if you have a larger selection group?
Yeah, I guess I can speak first. So to me, the single best bit of information you can get out of an event like this at this stage is how people are predicting and behaving in a round that's happening simultaneously, right? Because a lot of the practice we do these days is on TTS. Even when we're doing scrims, they're never happening simultaneously. They're kind of going on over the course of several weeks or whatever, trying to get these games out. And so seeing how people react to you coming up to them and saying, hey, I need you to push, seeing what somebody's predictions look like over the course of the game, and how that matches up to the reality of the board. It's all bits of information which you can only get at an environment like this.
Yeah.
And it's information which is critically important to understand about players in the lead up to selection at WTC, right? So to me, that was the single best thing that we extracted from this, and that's totally independent of any balanced data slavery. We could be playing Age of Sigmar, and it would have be able to have similar results, right? So thankfully we weren't though. But I would say that. But I would say that as far as like the balanced data slate is concerned, and kind of the rapidly changing landscape of 40K is maybe a better way of phrasing that, is I would say that any of the windows that go into the lead up to an event is going to be comparable to the window we're going to face when we come into August, right? So while the specific information and the specific data might change in the time we get to the event, how people operated in that window, how they innovated, how they thought about things, how they approached practice, and all of that is all really useful and really, really helpful. So I think that you have to kind of take you have to take a step back and look at, kind of abstract it a bit. And once you do so, and you begin to look at things like, hey, in this 3-month window leading up to the event or whatever, they practiced a ton. They learned about these matchups. They were really flexible with their practice pairings and stuff like that, understanding that, hey, this is good or bad. They pursued the bad matchups. It's really just learning about the players, I think, and incredibly useful ways.
Yeah. From my point of view, there's one thing that I always look when those events were happening, and this event not specifically because we just ended up coaching the Team USA, but as we explained before, it wasn't initially a plan that we would do it. But what I really look forward to getting out of those events is two main things. First one is how people work in terms of their character. And I do not mean this as them like being bad actors or whatnot. What I look forward to is seeing how they perform under pressure or what they need. Because my experience from previous WTCs, when I was being the captain or the pairings guy, I needed to understand the psychological profile of the player to, for example, know when they are saying something to me when talking about their estimation or how they put in the matrix, they are, for example, a person who's very pessimistic. And that's something that you learn over time. Or they are a person that will bring you higher scores if you ask them to push. Those are things that are, I think, mostly tied to a character of a given person. And those things are very important. And that's something that, for example, last year I based pairings on, that I knew that Kruger is a person that I can ask for pushing high scores. And I knew him as a player that likes doing that, while others are more of a defensive players who will fit different positions. And I find this is important also to an extent because you can, I think Ines is saying that there's not a thing like a playstyle. I disagree with that. I think there is a thing as a playstyle. And finding out what's like the preferred playstyle or psychological profile of a player before WTC comes, so you can give them something that fits them better, is very important. Sometimes it might not be a playstyle, it might be army style, like Scar bringing gunlines, right? But as soon as you learn that, you can then build better team comp, especially in the meta that's so open, as you mentioned, Nathan. That if there's so much changes happening, I find that landing people on what they feel comfortable in as like the baseline, as the start, and then trying to build a team comp around it, I find that's really important. And that's one of the things that I'm always looking for. And the other thing is to find, I think this is quite specific to me when I also went through like a lot of job interviews and whatnot, like interviewing people to join IT teams, is that the way people phrase themselves or like try to articulate their logical thinking about a given matchup shows me to what depth they are thinking about the game. And having one of those discussions where Brian was calling it the confessional, right? But hearing people explain a matchup shows me to what extent they thought it through. And then it brings me a baseline of how much I can expect those players to put that much thought into other pairings that they input into the matrix. So, yeah.
I've got a couple more questions.
Yeah.
First one, we'll go back a little bit back to armies, and then I'm going to ask you a question about pairings, matrices, Typhus. After Pyra, even though we discussed earlier, say, Brian, you were like, I don't think we took anything wrong, and I think a lot of teams probably didn't think they'd take anything wrong. Is there any armies after this event that you would now go, this is probably something we would look at? Either look at more or this is something we would take going forward?
I would put one of my best players on Voten right now to figure out if Germans are actually wrong.
Yeah,
I was going to say the Voten. I can't. I'm still picking out Dwarf Fist out of my teeth. Yeah, 100%. Voten, I think, is one. Chaos Knights is another one as well. I think those are both really interesting armies that haven't been given the credit they're due. At least, certainly, on our side of the pond, pretending that I'm living in London. So I think that I think those two are definitely the kind of the key ones. Obviously, we took Aspect Host for Eldar. I think we all, even before this event, we were like on the page of Yannari's probably the sauce, and we should be looking there. But after this event, even more so.
Sure.
So
kind of focusing in on that, I think, and then. But I think those are probably the main ones. I don't think there was any other really standouts that I can think of.
What about, where is Bridgehead Guard right now? Because it was mostly considered like a top 3. Every team's going to have a Bridgehead Guard. None of them performed that great. And then none of them did that great at Manchester either. So is it time to look at one of the other detachments in the new book, whether it be Hammer, whether it be Mechanized, or is Bridgehead still the thing?
I will give you my point of view as the pairings guy, because I looked what we did with Ben when we were doing the pairings. Guard was quite often put into like a very menacing armies or armies that you didn't really want anyone else to play. I found that guard was either a defender or a blunt army at some point that we didn't want to use another asset that we needed later. So, and I was walking around the hall and I found that not only it was case with Ben's guard, but I find that other guards were used in similar
Everyone,
manner.
I think we
Not
also
necessarily. Yeah.
I was going to say important context. I think is also that 2 of the rounds were tipping point, and Bridgehead Guard is not going to be good on the tipping point maps where
That is
you
true.
need to come down and get these angles, and you're playing Hammer and Anvil with tight ruins. That's, for example, my round 1 I played against Bridgehead Guard, and the map was just impossible for him to get any proper angles on.
Yeah.
Right, so
That's one thing about the new maps on tipping point. I think there are like 2 more that have staging ruins like 1 inch away from the side, from the long edge. So it means that you cannot ever get a shooting line into those staging ruins. And those are extremely good for any melee armies, or like even evading mobile shooting. Because the mobile shooting, if it gets there, it will never do it for free. You will always lose resources.
I think it became like, for example, from my perspective, it was really easy to control angles and with minimal commitment to stopping it, right? I basically had to put something towards the middle to stop them landing there and then seeing into the ruins. But otherwise, I was just staging my assets in places I already wanted to stage them, and I was screening out the whole space. And I think that really hurt Bridgehead quite a bit.
I think Bridgehead at this event, I wouldn't take as much away, weirdly enough, because I think the missions and like the setup or how they were used in the meta, I think they were used mostly as we don't really have an answer. Let's just put Bridgehead there.
Okay.
Or like defend with Bridgehead, take something we don't feel comfortable with, and like score 8 at least.
That said, I do think there's an element of Bridgehead which is being figured out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I still think it's an incredibly powerful army, and when it gets to do its thing, it's unfair. But people are getting better at stopping it from doing its thing as freely as they were before. And I think that has taken away, and I think that the Guard Codex is actually very deep. I'm voting night with Dave, so I hear about Guard every single day. And he, he's got a lot of really great ideas. So I think the Codex is quite deep. There's a lot of space to kind of move and innovate into, be it the mechanized guard or the tank one, or even just combined arms. Seeing Nas play a bunch of games with that, for example, and that's a hallmark of a good Codex, right? So even if Bridgehead ends up moving a little bit away from that because it's a bit more solved, I think Guard is going to be in the 8 for the foreseeable.
Yeah, I can agree with that. The other question I was going to ask you, Typhus, was a bit more about Matrix. Now, I'm struggling to think of a way of phrasing this, but we'll say one thing England's always struggled with a little bit is getting the Matrix correct. So when you're doing things like pairings, I'm sure that affects quite a lot of other teams. And we had a conversation earlier about almost justifying your Matrix colors sometimes. And like, how much when you're pairing, do you feel like those Matrix colors have to be correct for you to do your job correctly? Or do you have a degree of standard deviation that allows the Matrix to be off to a certain extent that you can still work with how everything is supposed to go?
Okay.
I phrased that terribly.
So I think so what you're asking is how precise my player needs to be, right? Like if it's, for example, like his game, he expects to get from 6 to 10, but like the orange or yellow, like both can kind of apply there. Like you never really.
Yeah.
So my main point of view is that after looking at the pairing matrix for a very long time, I try to figure out what are pivotal assumptions in a given approach to a given pairing. So let's say, for example, I look at a given matchup or like one army and I decide, well, what would happen if I based my whole pairing strategy for this team, for example, to pin their Chaos Knights? Because their Chaos Knights have 4 very good matchups into us, 4 very bad. But I need to know, for example, which one of those bad matchups is like the least bad in case the plan just doesn't work. And then based on that, I will also ask like which of the greens in the matrix has like the highest volatility or whatnot. So I use it as a baseline before I start figuring out what will be my process of doing the pairings. And I kind of have after the years, I have few ways of doing those pairings. I have ways of doing the pairings to avoid reds. I have ways of doing the pairings to just always keep the pins, which is my default, by the way. I try to figure out the way with keeping the pins for everything to not let any good defender in. That's my default way. But if I do not see this working, then I have like secondary modes of how I try to approach a matrix. And like the secondary modes are avoid the very bad matchups or go for a lot of drawish matchups that I know my players should be more comfortable dragging for like 12, because I know the person who's like, I know a yellow and the yellow, one might be an 8, one might be more towards 12, right? But that's where I find that it's very important that me as a pairing person, I know every player and their tendencies, because in my mind, I treat those colors with a little bit more information, but it's biased on my knowledge of the player. But also there are like approaches for pairings that you just sacrifice someone to take out an army. So for example, that's what we did against Sweden. It didn't really work, but that's what I tried, is to sacrifice 2 armies to get like 3-4 very good matchups, if possible. And there's like few modes of pairings that I find, depending on which one I'm trying to achieve in a given pairing process, different singular cells in the matrix will be pivotal. Because if my assumption that I want to pin Chaos Knights is wrong on one of those players getting a green into them, and I did whole pairing to pin Chaos Knights and he loses the game, that is like the worst case scenario, because I probably sacrifice 1 or 2 people to get drawish scores into Chaos Knights, into something. And then from the one pairing that I tried everything to do, I get not what I expected. And those are like singular matrices that I found that I would ask about specific column usually when I use our players are rows, the opponents are columns. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, you did. No, it's matrix work is always like from the question earlier a little bit about what do you find out from this. I think actually from say a Team England perspective, one of the things that we were testing quite a lot, or I believe captaincy was testing quite a lot, is how good are people at doing matrices, because we've all seen them where some people are like, everything's a green because, well, that's, to be honest, that's how you did them, Brian, in fairness. Unless it's Josh, you just put a green for everything. Then, but, and then some people are, everything's super pessimistic. So I think matrix work is, to be honest, it's nowadays is with how different every army is, and then how different every sub-faction of that army is, it's so hard now to actually get a good matrix.
Also, like if you include, like you have your baseline, you probably have super matrix with what you think is the state of the meta overall. That's something that you base your final team comp on.
Sure.
But that's like your baseline. But then you do not account for the fact that then you are playing tipping point and opponent is choosing a board when you are choosing the team comp. And suddenly that's why, and you cannot account for all of that. You are just waiting because that's way too much data. And I find that's why from time to time at the event, you will have just a worse round to face a team, because just the mission or the deployments or whatever just doesn't align. And what I find is that people are lacking the most, and that's something that I've done, what we were handing out to our players before the event, is that people aren't that as well versed with assessing the impact of the board choice, because people usually haven't played every single map on every single mission, right? But what we tried to do with the Polish team was we had like those maps that were marking where are the hiding spots. If opponent moved like up to 12 inches from their deployment zone, to grab all the angles, so where you can hide, what are the angles opponent catches, so how close they are. So you just had a visualization of, where you can stand within turn one, where you can deploy so you are safe, etc., etc. So to just cut some of the work that player has to do, because you just have everything visible. You have so much space here, as long as you don't stick outside of the ruin because you're too tall. So I find that the table choices are the most important, and this is something that every single year Team Poland gets caught on, because it's not only the fact that you should be choosing your best table, as a second defender. You might be choosing your third best table, but to take out one of those egregious tables later down the road. And that's something that you have to have a lot of reps with your team comp, and what every single army wants to avoid, to know that they might just get caught on their worst board choice down in Scrum, so suddenly it doesn't work.
Like something
so
up.
Yeah.
Sorry, Karen.
Go on.
No, it's something I suggested to Tony this year, where if we can, at a practice weekend or whatever, obviously I know we play a lot of TTS, but if we can get to an actual physical place where we, each round or each of the table choices, we literally set up all of the 8 tables, and you just spend half the day just deploying your armies. Being like, oh, actually, this is quite good for this movement. This is where I can deploy stuff. Oh, actually, in this mission, on these tables, I know I need to reserve this, this, and this because I physically can't fit. Otherwise, it's just getting ahead of it and being able to actually, especially because the tables seem to be different and things. So I don't know.
That's one of the things, for example, Leshu did in our team, that he had pre-planned deployments into nearly everything on TTS. And he just pulled up as he knew everything, which is insane if you ask me, but some people are like that.
How often do you find, Typhus, that you have to either turn it up or down, or that you do turn it up or down depending on the player? Because I think some players are better at that abstract analysis of looking at a map and just kind of like visualizing how the game's going to play out if they have a given scenario, versus other people who really have to like find out, right? And how do you find is it challenging to kind of pinpoint those people, or once you do, you're able to really focus?
That's one of the things that I was talking about, character and learning people. For example, I know to some extent that Scar cannot choose his own board for shit. And that was a problem throughout the years. And we've decided that, for example, when doing pairings last year, I was the main pairing guy, but as soon as it came to board choices, I would tell the boys what is my plan, how you should take the board choices. And there would be a group of Pumba, Maison, and the person who's actually playing that game, deciding which board they are taking. And I find this shouldn't be a single person decision, because it is easy to get tunnel visioned into what you are thinking the game is going, especially maybe now it won't be as much of it because with how maybe diverse the meta will be, but grabbing the player of the opposite faction, what they want the least, etc., is very important to at least run through. But at the same time, you might grab them, but then Anthony might be grabbing Nick, where they're playing testing meant that Anthony would pick a board that he's playing not to lose, right? Whilst in reality, there might be some like outside info that you are missing. So you never will find a best solution. but I find it should be a group vote what table choice you are taking.
It makes a lot of sense.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I really like the idea of taking time to understand the maps, because I think this is like, it happens so often that after like a certain round, 1 or 2 players were, no, that wasn't a good map for me. And I'm like, if there was only a way to know that.
Like,
And
I've never really taken any of that all that seriously, but because I'm applying for the team this year, I have my own set of WTC terrain. I am probably going to be that sad kid who will spend a weekend just deploying tables and deploying armies. But unfortunately, that is what you have to do these days, because I personally don't trust TTS to do it for me.
I would do it with a second person. Like, don't do it solo.
Yeah.
Just go with someone to just run through the ideas, because otherwise you are just not gonna do it. Like, come on, do you really have the constitution in yourself to stand there for 3 hours putting your toy soldiers and shuffling the big elves? No, man, that's just
I'm absolutely riddled with ADHD, so the likelihood of me actually doing it sounds great on paper, but I won't actually be doing that probably. If I get somebody else to motivate me, or I'll just drive to Brian's house and bring my terrain.
I think one of the big takeaways, at least for some of our guys, and certainly for me, from this weekend as well, is just I think that we always talk about, TTS is not the same as playing in real life, and I think a lot of people play on TTS a lot roll their eyes at that, and the people that play in real life are like, yeah, obviously that's true, right? And there's a bit of a disconnect there, but I actually think that WTC terrain specifically exasperates the delta between the two, because WTC terrain is just very clumsy to play on in real life. The ruins are tall; they're made of like cardboard, oftentimes, right? They get knocked around really easily. Seeing
they're
things
quite dark, so models can sometimes just disappear,
and it makes a big difference. And I think a disproportionate one than, say, like playing on UKTC or something like that, right? Or even GW trade or something along those lines, where yes, there probably is a bit of a difference, but I think it's certainly less so. I think WTC really, really start to feel that, and I think that we saw that in some of our games and results that we were getting. I certainly felt that in the reduced time scale that we had for the games at Pyra. And I've played a lot of Orcs. I've played a lot of Orcs on WC terrain as well, but it's still like, playing on new maps, new boards. It just gets sloppy quickly, right? And so kind of being comfortable in the slop is important, I think, and you can only get that in real life reps.
Yeah.
For sure.
Any other questions, guys, that popped up into your head?
David Gaylard's asked a very good question in the chat.
Yeah. Do teams have a practice of a peer review of a particular player? Like Brian peer reviews David's Matrix, who peer reviews Nathan's, etc.
So, for England, we've never really... We've all looked at a matrix as a team and done like discussions about it, but we've never really gone to the point where people... I think we've always just kind of trusted that the faction specialist knows their army better than we do, and kind of the matrix, unless we see something completely egregious, we don't really change somebody's own matrix. But I think that you should peer review from almost the anti-matrix version of it, going, if I was using, like we discussed earlier, if I was using Death Guard versus this, actually, I think that's a good matchup. So, look, we do need to discuss this. But again, if you have way too many people commenting on a matrix, or convinces a player... If you're a faction specialist and you say, look, I've played this a couple of times and I keep getting like 7s, but the rest of your team say, oh, no, you should be beating that. It's 13-7 to you. That also isn't helpful. So, yeah.
That's why we had how Brian called it the confessional. We have 2-3 people who will talk with you at the WTC itself. We'll go. Last year we had like 20-minute time slots for every player assigned after we came back to the hotel, and every single one of those players would sit down with me, Pumba, and Mason and Marish, and we would go through every single one of those estimations thoroughly of every single player and just take another one. So we kind of had that process, and I have a very strong opinion that it shouldn't be a group. It shouldn't be like your whole team going through it. You should have only subgroup of that, because people will not be like, you will not understand to such depth a different faction. And I just do not really agree that it should be even before the event. Like, it is nice if you can skim from someone's estimations, if you're stuck in traffic and you are just scrolling, or you're commuting and you are just spending your time in any productive way instead of just watching a guy jump over trains whilst, I don't know, what was the name of that videos that I watched, because my brain also needs 5 fucking things happening on the screen. Anyway, what I was trying to say is that I don't think you should be spending as much time on it. You probably should have few people who have their job dedicated to skim through it. For example, when my son was doing sisters estimations at WTC, it was my role to check it. You might have one person dedicated, but other than that, I don't think it's as worthwhile, because it would be better for a player to probably play one more game than go through estimations. And if you have a dedicated coaching team that will go through those estimations and pinpoint them, then after pinpointing them, you can have a discussion on Discord in a written way, for example. So everyone else can also read it, and it doesn't get lost in a group call. But
Yeah,
that's just my opinion.
I think there's actually a lot of really interesting psychology in kind of the process and how you approach it too, right? I mean, if you have a lot of people in a group and the whole team is commenting on the matrix, I would imagine people would be more defensive and less likely to kind of have a conversation about it, right? Because they're going to dig their hands in and not look foolish, to their feet, excuse me. And similarly, like how you approach it with the SMEs, if you will, that are questioning the matrix, which are not even trying not to come across as questioning, but rather just being like, you would like to understand, and having people explain it to you. I think has just like the way you approach the communication is it's really important. Getting people to kind of be in the right headspace for that. And
as the person who's doing the pairings, I also ask those questions, so I make myself small notes for the pairing process later. But I do it only at WTC, because the other events do not require such preparation.
Yeah, the psychology part's interesting sometimes, because I know in previous team events that I've gone to, I've definitely, talked myself out of taking specific armies because I thought the matrix didn't look good. It might actually serve a role or serve a purpose, but I've definitely done matrices sometimes where I've gone, I don't want people in the rest of the team to look at this as being super negative. So either I won't take this army, or I'll put a positive result when it actually might not be positive. So it's matrix work is, I hate matrix work.
There's and having an army that doesn't really have good matchups isn't always very wrong idea. Because, for example, in 23 we had Tau on our team that had 2 good matchups into Custodes and something else, some other army that was meant to be quite popular. And other than that, it didn't really have good matchups. But what was the idea is that you are used as a pin, and later you get shit, but someone else doesn't get the shit, and someone else scores high. And it was meant, I think Tyler spoke about it, that basically when you look at how we paired at this Pyra, with how Tyler was used in the pairing process, is that he landed few people very high scores because they were chosen instead of him, and then he would land on a very bad score, and people would sometimes judge those armies for having a low score at the end of the event, right? Whilst you do not see the indirect results of them being on the team. Like, for example, when you were playing Stampede, Nathan, in October, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have high scores, but you were used in a specific role that enabled others to score high. And it is something that cannot really be valued on just face value of the end score of the team. And people will be praising, like, in 23, Skark was the highest scorer. In 24, I don't even remember who. It was Olivia, right? But at the same time, those happen because you had the team comp that allowed for it. So sometimes taking well-known, slightly worse army might be beneficial because you can use it to more, like, you will not end up in one of those matchups where you expected a win and you put in the preparation to do Matrix for that win, right?
Yeah, the more the meta kind of becomes wide open, and kind of, as we said at the beginning, everything's kind of acceptable, and the more I personally am valuing stability. I want people to know what they're going to get and to get what they say they're going to get. And then if we can use those resources, as you said, as weapons in the pairing process, like exactly like how we were using Tyler with that mech, then that's fantastic. But what the most important thing to me is that what we think we're going to get in a given matrix is going to be kind of the result that comes out. And that to me is about playing a worse matrix with an army better is more powerful. And I've kind of felt that way in general for teams as we've kind of gone, and I've been a bit spoiled with respect to some of my teammates being really, really good. And so, kind of having that a stable, accurate matrix, and then trying to outplay your opponents on the board is something which I've been lucky enough to be able to participate in for most of my team events I plan. At the WC level, that's not always going to be the case, but I still think that there's a lot of value in that stability because you don't lose a round because a draw slipped down to an orange, right? You lose a round because your green is suddenly a red, right? And so if you can avoid that, then you can leave the rest to the boys on the table, right?
Yeah. And that's also another reason to sometimes go for niche comfort picks. Like last year, we had Leshu on Custodes, where he felt comfortable, and people thought that army was bad. Because probably you are forcing your opponent to make mistakes in the matrix. Those same mistakes that Brian just mentioned that you need to avoid. And that's something that was used throughout multiple teams. So yeah, it is always quite complex, and I think it will just be depending on the meta. And I'm super glad that I will not be the person responsible for team comp, because fuck me, that sounds awful. Any other questions you guys have? Anything popped up?
Pretty good. Oh, I guess we're a teams podcast. I guess a very quick one. Where do we think EC will be in teams? I seem to think that they are probably actually going to be quite popular because I don't think they're going to be great at singles.
Brian?
I think Emperor Stroden is quite a bit better than it seems on paper. But I suspect that after it all settles and people are more used to how to play against the army and everything else, they'll probably fall into a similar category as World Eaters, where if you've got the right guy, then they're an army you take, and guy or gals. But I think that it's not an army which I would expect to be in every 8 because of its current power level, at least. But it is an army which I could see in any 8 with the right plan.
For sure.
Yeah. I would need to see it more on the board, but I echo the vibe of it feeling like Board Eaters, just on the face value. You have scouting, advancing melee, which after like turn 2 hits hard because you killed some shit, right? Like it feels similar. I don't think it will create a meta shift, but it will be another army that can just bring very high scores. I would expect that if someone fucks around, they will find out. but again, you need to have a proficient aggressive player. I do not even think it needs to be specifically Emperor's Children player. Like, when I look back at our super teams that we assemble, I would feel fine putting Brian or Anthony on this army. Like, those are players that could pull it off. It's just a playstyle they are completely familiar with. So yeah, maybe let's go into show questions. And I will not be doing the full plugs, but if you're enjoying what we're saying, you can join Patreon. And then on the Discord channel there, you can ask us questions that we'll be answering at the end of those episodes. And first of all, at WTC, secret missions made the game very close and hard to push differentials. How impactful were they at Pyra? I don't think there was a single secret mission at Pyra. Have you heard about any, Brian?
One of my opponents at one point considered it and then realized very quickly that it was a terrible idea. So no, I don't think it had any impact whatsoever. I think the changes they made with Pariah have really kind of put secret missions away.
Yeah, it's the same as in previous player pack that we played. I mean, like the before the new secret missions, like a year ago. How would you use Plague Storm in pairings, Nathan?
First of all, it depends what terrain you're using. If it's WTC, probably don't use it. Fire lane's kind of sucky. It gets boned by Eldar, so it doesn't get boned by Eldar. You can play Eldar, but it doesn't. Eldar is really annoying for it if they know how to play the game properly, which I won't announce on the podcast. If I ever want to use this army again. I liked using it at ITT in this is a put forward army. If you throw your weaker armies against it, it will beat you. So if you want to get a win out of Plague Storm, you have to throw something significant at it, which fine, even if I come out of that game with 6 to 10 points, I've done our pairings a massive favor. So that's just kind of how I like to use it. But I believe it's not a Plague Storm list, it's a lot more hybrid. But say the French list at Pyra, going 5-0, good scores. I think he was a lot more sometimes put forward, sometimes prayed, sometimes late. I think it was a lot more flexible in the way it worked on the WTC terrain. So yeah.
Without disclosing too much, how have you found the new WTC maps? We kind of covered it. Maybe you have something to add there, Brian, as a person who played them?
I would just say, I think they probably need to cook a little more. But the removal of Super Elves has been amazing. I hate Super Elves. I'm glad they're gone. Anything is better than that. I think we probably got to cook on them a little more, though. Like I said, just tweak them a little bit. But
Harbor and Anvil deployment / tipping point, I think, need just a redesign. As I mentioned, I think the problem is the actual type of terrain pieces you have, because I don't think those work on those boards, and no matter what you do, it is awful. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the solution is, I don't know, using way more containers, if anything, if we are using the same pieces. So yeah. Okay, where did you think Team USA did well, and where did you feel improvements have to be made? Brian?
I think that I really like the prep that our guys put into the event. They put a lot of effort in. They worked hard, and that's awesome. That's what I want to see. I think there was a bit of that translation issue with respect to TTS to real life. That probably should be explored a little deeper from us, and something could be done better. And I think that we can all get a little bit better about not looking at having a bad entry on your matrix as a sign of weakness. And changing your matrix to be worse is not you saying that you're a worse player, right? And I think that getting comfortable with that is something that we all have to struggle with. It's all an ego game for all of us, right? And it's not necessarily that Team USA was particularly bad at that or anything, but I think it's something which we as players in any capacity on any team can get better at. And I think that's definitely still true for USA as well.
Yeah. What stood out to me was estimations throughout the round, but it's something that you just need to play enough with open score sheet right in front of your eyes, not in your phone, because the phone app you will not be tracking. You are just putting in the scores. You are not looking at the summary usually. Have a score sheet in front of you, and then you can give proper estimations. That was the biggest takeaway for me. What do I feel Team USA did differently compared to Polish teams, for better or worse? I do not have much info on to prep. I can only talk about at the event. And I find there was one thing that stood out to me and Pumba quite a lot. I felt like every single person that was there, except maybe Brian and Anthony, was there to learn. And I felt like immense amount of respect from the players. Like whenever me or Pumba started talking about something and explaining a topic about teams, like they would listen. And that's something that I'm just not used to. And it was that not a single Polish guy will start trolling me at that point or like start zeroing a beer in the background. It was surely a difference. But I cannot say much because it was only at the event and we weren't like a real team, right? It was just a test event. It looks like a lot of the teams will be bringing new players. Is this a sign that the increased practice needed to compete is going to burn out players quickly? I think it already did, but Nathan, maybe do you have any insights from Team England losing half of the players because of different reasons?
Yeah, like I think it is. So I did 8 years in a row for England, and I think I will probably end up putting almost more prep into this 1 year than I did those 8 previous years, because the game has got to a point where it is almost like a semi-professional esports team now. If you want to win it. If you don't want to win it and you just want to go have fun, have a lads weekend, get drunk, great. That's great. Ooh, somebody's meditating. But yeah, I would be very surprised if the burnout doesn't affect people from going, look, I've done 2-3 years, I want a year out, come back to it. And then, especially for Team England, a lot of it's just life stuff. People having families, people getting married, people starting new jobs, whatever it might be. So, yeah, I think the amount that you have to prep for it, it's just not really something. And I can't even comment because I haven't done it fully yet. But like Brian, you'll know from last year and Typhus from the last few years where it's a whole lot of prep if you want to do well. So
yeah, it's interesting. One thing I've been struggling with this year compared to last is exactly how to work hard properly, right? Because the reality is that this just playing games and grinding games is not going to get you there, right? The search space necessary to play every game and every matchup enough times with meaningful data is intractable. It's not something which you're ever going to successfully do, right? So the idea that you're going to do that by just putting your head down and working hard is idiotic. So, and also with, as we talked about earlier, with all the rules changing, often the last couple of years at least, it's been a new set of rules right before kind of list sub, which is kind of thrown everything, through a loop. It raises the question of when should you kick it up into high gear, right? So it's like, are you just working hard to work hard, or are you working hard because it's having an actual beneficial effect on you and your team's success? And I think that the answer is somewhere in the middle. And one thing that I've been trying to figure out this year is exactly trying to get a little more clarity on that and get an idea what is an appropriate amount of work. Because if you just put your head down, if I did the amount of work that I put in last year for the entire year this year, I would be a husk by the time we made it to August. It just wouldn't be possible, right? So trying to find a way to work hard that yields good results and not just work hard for the sake of feeling like I worked hard is I think a really important balance.
I think the absolute base is having a job that you can pretend that you're working.
Yeah.
And like I'm not even like, it is semi-joke, but I'm not really a joke. Like, you need to be able to, at work, for example, have a Discord where people are playing a game and just watching in the background and listening. Like, that's just something that you need to be able to do, I find.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why myself, I am on the team for a year, and for a year I am not. Because it is just not sustainable for me, and the burnout is real. And I find that even when I try to optimize, the amount of work that I would need to put in for me to also feel fine to be on the team is so high that I cannot do it every year. So I'm also feeling okay with myself, as in I am not torpedoing the team for me not doing enough. And you cannot do it every year. I still don't know how I did it last year with wedding and side projects and regular work that was actually kicking my ass. The answer is not sleeping, but yeah, it's just way too much. And I think this will be a common problem because 40K, with how much changes there are, will require more and more. I even had like a longer talk with my son about it. If you could just know that new stuff drops in June, and we just decide that we work a shit ton from June, July, August, and the rest of the year we just kind of vibe through, I could see that happening every year. But it is not fair for the people who are up and coming and do not yet have the amount of experience to do it. Because I feel fine that if I started playing again in early June while being slightly up to date, I could get up to speed in 2 months. But you still need to create a system that allows new faces to come into the team. So it requires everyone to work throughout the year, but like to the same extent, probably Skark will not put the same amount of work as Crooker did on his first year that he was trying to get, right? Like, it's just not happening. So yeah, this is a tough problem, and I don't think it will be solved at all.
I think a lot of, for me, a lot of it's coming down to redefining what kind of work I'm putting in at what stage of the process, right? So like at this stage of the process, I'm trying to look at it as my role should be much more focused on player development and understanding, you know, in our case, our academy folks, and trying to help them progress and participate in that space rather than having it be focused on me sitting there playing lots of games, trying to make my orc matrix as accurate as possible at this stage of the game. And I think that if you can, if that should, I think, help with burnout to an extent, because yes, you're working hard the entire time, but the nature of that work is changing as you go and keeping it more interesting and kind of progressing along that way. And so I think that, you know, that's probably the best way, I think, for somebody in more veteran status to approach that.
Yeah. Upskill people so you are not needed at some point, just like in work. So that's like in every aspect of life. What roles do you guys think Emperor's Children will end up in the team's meta? We touched upon because Nathan asked about it. How do we think events will handle demon data sheets being printed in the Legion codexes? I don't think it will matter at all. It's just in the book. It will not be treated as if you took the Legion of Access Slaanesh Emperor Children detachment that you cannot take any Slaanesh demons. I don't expect that to be a thing. In the same way that taking Incubi in Inari wouldn't stop you from taking Incubi in Drukhari if you take them. But
yeah, I think demons are going to be fine.
Okay, the question: what are some red and green matchups for Ward Eaters? I have no clue, Brian. You're the closest to a person who might know something about Ward Eaters.
I think that the bad matchups that World Eaters have are when Anthony goes second, which he hasn't found one yet. I think that Tactical is a matchup that I don't think World Eaters wants. Which is an interesting switch. I feel like World Eaters had actually been pretty good into Orcs up to that point, but when Orcs got guns and World Eaters didn't, suddenly that matchup got pretty bad. But I would say that it tends to be armies which are really quick with a lot of damage that can also try and collapse sections of the board, right? So historically, Eldar is one of those armies also, which is kind of bad because they're able to just kind of zip around the board and duck and dive for your big haymaker hits, collapse small sections of the board with focused fire and damage, and then move on to another section where you can't be hit back quite as well as you might want to be, especially because World Eaters like to play these kind of like wolf pack games where they're focusing down sections of the board themselves. And so having somebody do that a bit better is kind of a recipe for not working out quite well. And then green matchups are just going to be anything you can punch in the face that doesn't want to be punched in the face, right? So
Chaos Knight.
You can catch it and you can hit it. It's probably green. Yeah, Chaos Knight's an example.
How do you guys suggest I explain to people that playing 40k, that people never heard about 40k, and that playing 40k competitively can be a big deal? Like I tried to explain to my co-worker, I went to WTC last year. Well, we are still playing a fucking plastic toy soldiers, which always makes it worse.
So
I don't. Yeah, Nathan.
This is how I handle it with Tinder dates. You be super vague about what Warhammer is. You just say that you're really fucking good at something. Usually gets you pretty far through it. So it kind of ends up being like, I play a game, I play a board game or something, but like I'm a 3-time world medalist. That seems to cover that enough. They usually, if this is specifically Tinder girls, they're usually not interested enough in you anyway to ask follow questions. So you're usually fine. Co-workers, if you can, try and get time off work to do the events, because sometimes you can, like, I remember Mike Porter used to get time off teaching to go and compete, which was always fun. They used to just give him time off. But I think you can frame it in a way that doesn't actually expose what the game is, I guess is how I would answer that.
Yeah, I think the reality is that we like to kind of laugh about, oh, this is a game of toy soldiers and we're playing with fun little war dollies. But the reality is, you're putting a lot of effort into something, and there's a confidence that's associated with that, which is appealing to people, right? So the Warhammer part of that is just the vessel through which you kind of channel that confidence. So being on the national team of anything is impressive. So you focus on that side, and then if they're interested, maybe don't go too deeply into the lore of that particular Necron warrior Gitto, but you can try and focus on the more abstract nature of it. My go-to phrase is it's like a cross between Risk and chess. That usually grounds it enough for people where they kind of get it, right? So,
yeah.
And I also found, for me, one thing that really worked is also that I have really good friends across the world now. So, for example, me mentioning that. So basically, I just went for a weekend in Dallas because my friend hosted me, or like I went to London with one of my best friends to watch musicals because we played toy soldiers, not even against each other, but like in a weird situation where we got to know each other. And I think this is also a thing to sell, that you are basically having a big, very welcoming community that's completely mixed in terms of the professions. I think this is also quite important, that when I was talking about it at work and explaining it to people that I also really enjoyed this community because I just go over for a weekend and I'm not meeting people that I will just talk more about work or like my daily life. We'll just completely disconnect from that because we do not have as much of shared space in that sense. So we just talk about anything, some dumb stories, etc. So it allows you to detach from your daily life. That I find you not necessarily get if you go out with friends from work, right? Because you are still friends from work.
Yeah, I mean, the parts of this that we all love are the parts of it that everybody loves with everything they're going to, right? The connections, the competition, everything like that. Just phrase it in relatable ways, and the details of what Warhammer actually is. It's nice to maybe mention on the periphery, but that's not why we're doing it, right? This could be anything.
Oh yeah, like I've definitely had it where I'm like, it's the friend. This is going to sound such a like Sesame Street answer, but it's just like, it's the friends you make, not the game that you play. Because I couldn't give a fuck about 40k sometimes, but I'm like, I got to go to Dallas as well. I got to go to Austria last year. I got to go to Poland last year. I got to go to half the countries in Europe to go play a game. It's, if you can talk to people about that. My other main hobby is jiu-jitsu. So trying to tell athletes that you play a game of toys far more competitively than you do a competitive sport, if you frame it in a way that it's like, I get to travel, I get to meet all my friends, I get to spend weekends with people, and again, talk about the hobby that you love doing, then yeah, that's why you do it.
Yep. And the last question: what is so special about voting with Germany and France taking them and doing well with them? Are they just listening to most things? And I think the answer I have is I don't know yet.
They're meat and potatoes, but meat and potatoes is delicious sometimes. So they're not surprising because we've all played the same index again and again and again. They're an acquired taste, so you don't see them enough, I guess, is maybe why they get a bit of faction speciality. But they have good transports, they have good infantry, they have good combat, they have good shooting. It's maybe a little bit on the random side sometimes with the fight on death or the number of shots or the D6 damages and whatnot, but they do actually do everything in the game quite well. So if you like have a Tim knocking about who's really fucking good with them, then yeah, I guess. But you got panned by them, Brian. So
yeah, so I did. I got really rooked by them. I think you forget a lot of times some of the things that they really have going for them too. Like as a general rule, their army ignores cover. That's pretty good with a lot of things, right? Also, as a sneaky little side effect to my army of stealth and cover, they also ignore stealth. So that's also super cool from an orc perspective, with a bunch of damage to weapons that wound me on 3s. So I think that they're an army which people look past because they're not sexy. The reality is that when played well and played correctly, they're just quite powerful. And I think there's an element of this as well, which is true regardless of the army, which I know it's a theme we keep coming back to, but is just being really good with any army in the meta right now is going to pay dividends, right? So the part that I'm personally trying to reconcile is Votann really good, or is Tim really good with Votann? And the answer is probably yes to both, but how much of the performance was Tim and how much of the performance was, or Tim with Votann versus how much the performance was Votann itself. Either way, I think the appreciation for Votann has gone up for me. But I'm still not entirely sure which one of those two it is. Is it mostly just a really good pilot playing an army really well, or is it that the army is better than I'm giving it, even better still than I'm giving it credit for?
And that was the last question. Thank you very much for joining us today, Brian. It's
Yeah.
always nice to have a deeper talk and not the ones that we usually have with Pumbaa. So much appreciated. We didn't basically insult people throughout the whole episode. It felt weird, except Gito for a moment, but he deserves it. Anyway, thank you very much for joining in, and see you in the next one.